Thanks, Adriana. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Happy post Labor Day back to school for everyone, and welcome to our webinar with the CEO of Praxis Precision Medicine, Marcio Souza. Marcio, thanks for joining us this morning.
Of
The
course, thank you.
topic of the webinar is going to be everything that you guys presented at the IES conference over this past Labor Day weekend in Portugal, and including data detail from the Radiant study, which was recently released at a top line level. But we have a lot more responder analysis and data curves to discuss today. And I will be doing some screen sharing. Praxis does have these posters on their website in the public domain as we discuss them. So feel free to follow along on the screen share, but also we at TD Cowen can send these posters to you as well, and you can access them on the website. Sorry, I did not intro myself. I'm Ritu Baral, covering analyst at TD Cowen. And Marcio, you and I have worked together for a number of years. And I think it's been a while since we've had, I think, such a robust data set across such a
Right.
nice portfolio of drugs to discuss post a medical meeting. Before we jump into Radiant, which is most of my inbound client questions of vormatrigine, what were some of the other Praxis highlights from the IEC conference this
Yeah,
past
no,
week?
and I appreciate it. It's like still here, still pretty busy, the
Mhm.
conference in
Oh, you're
Lisbon,
still in
right?
Portugal?
Yes,
Oh,
I
okay.
am. But it's fun and so on. So the team is still there. And I just hopped it in here. I'm gonna
Mhm.
go back to continue meeting. The meeting's being really incredible, and I think we share that with all the physicians and everyone's attending. It's like a little bit over 4,000 attendees. Incredibly high engagement. I think what with the feedback we hear the most, right? And we heard a lot, like over 100 meetings that I participated in with physicians on the last several days, one-on-ones, is just how impressed they are with the progress and how excited. And I can tell you how many people that came in to actually ask to participate or to have access to the different drugs. So it's very good to see across not only ourselves but other companies developing drugs in the epilepsy space, how much is being done. We are, and I'm sure, going to be talking a lot about permatrogene, and everyone is very excited about that, and all the studies that are like ongoing, the studies that are planned, as I'm sure going to be covering. But I would say it's quite interesting the overall interest on like relutrigine and elsunersen as well.
Mhm.
You talked about what we presented, like there's over 15 presentations from Praxis. So I don't think we're going to possibly cover all of them here. But we decided, and we got a lot of questions, particularly yesterday in our receptions, like the depth of the pipeline and what we're presenting and so on. People like kind of why some of the basic research, why are you putting stuff like that? And we're really committed to understand better epilepsy. Part of that is like empower, for example,
Mhm.
and understanding what these patients, the markets. I think it's quite important for investors as well, right? It's a much bigger market than we thought, even when we started developing these drugs. The unmet need is unfortunately pretty large,
Mhm.
which is kind of good for us in a sense, but hopefully, we can make that smaller as we move forward. And in general, having these alternatives for these patients is very needed. When you look into the conference at large, I think what we collect a lot of notes and stuff like that, what hearing a lot is that, yes, a lot changed in the last several years. I would say particularly if you go through the abstracts, there was a lot about cenobamate, for example, a
Mhm.
lot about like what people success they had, but also a reality check in a sense on just how hard it is to achieve the best possible use with that drug and how welcoming they are for something like formatrogene. So even the positives, I think, comes with excitement for what you're bringing next, and everyone else as well. It's not only ourselves. I think there is general excitement about drug development in this space because it was dormant for a few years.
Mhm.
So again, incredibly exciting to be here, and I couldn't like have even all the planning we did for the meeting. I couldn't imagine how much we would receive from this physician. So it's been great.
That's great to hear. So we're going to jump right now into the Radiant poster. I'm actually going to share my screen as I put my reading glasses on because I'm apparently old and blind. You guys see that okay? And folks
Yeah.
on the line, please email me any questions you guys have as we are having this discussion, and I'll get them into Marcio. So Radiant, Marcio, can you review briefly the design, which we have over
Yeah.
here, and
Yeah.
the purpose of this study? What did you want
Absolutely.
it to show? I'm gonna make it a little
Yeah.
bit.
So if you recall, like where we were like about 1 year or so ago, right, with the program with vormatrigine, we understood what could do like pretty well, and I would say in animal models that are very predictive, as we previously discussed.
Mhm.
We knew a little bit, and then we knew a lot more on what was done in healthy volunteers and the potential to be used. And we had the results from the PPR study.
Yeah.
And while those patients are patients with epilepsy, there were a couple of things that were missing for us. So one is what happens instead of using, I'm going to call a biomarker, the PPR results, but we actually use the reduction in seizures. That's what mostly affects this patient's life. Trying to have an understanding of that. So that was one of the objectives for Radiant. The second was really to understand how the PK and the PK-PD relationship works in patients with epilepsy, particularly with focal onset seizures. That's the cohort that is here. Of course, we have data as well, and we're going to have more data to be presented later in the year on the generalized epilepsy, and to answer that question specifically as well, right? I think generalized is very clear, like say smaller in terms of number of patients, but it's actually very large in terms of the unmet needs and the need for new drugs as well, as it relates to focal onsets, for example. But so we wanted to understand that. And the overall, I would say, dynamics of studies with epilepsy, it's always on the back of our minds as well. I think we checked kind of most, if not all, those boxes. Of course, you haven't seen the generalized data yet,
Yeah.
but we're going to have that soon. But for all the others we mentioned, like we checked all those boxes.
Got it. So the data from this from Radiant was great. We're looking here. This is the 56% sustained overall seizure reduction rate, as we can see over here. And for the first time we saw this curve, it almost looks like, well, first of all, there seems to be this very, very rapid response. So that it almost looks like 50+% seizure reductions is reached at like 1 week. Is that that sort of very rapid early response? Is that a good interpretation of sort of the first few weeks of this graph? And also, like how rapid, because that first time point is day 7, how rapid is the seizure reduction that was seen in this trial?
No, absolutely. So the process itself of seizure, right? That's how we'll always start. Like what we know and kind of how we use is collecting this like in kind of monthly increments, right? Every 4 weeks, I think we round up to monthly there. So every time we collapse there. But the question, and maybe I should have said that in the intro, one of the things that I heard again and again from key opinion leaders, treating physicians here is the time between seizures. And something that I actually honestly haven't heard as much before, how much emphasis is being put lately on days in between seizures, right? So when you talk about I'm going to go back to your question about like what happened in the first week, in the second week, in the third week, as you are increasing this time between seizures. I think that's one of the ways to look into that. So what we see right off the gates is this like very rapid response, right? Reduction
because
in
you don't
seizures,
titrate. You don't need to titrate.
Go titration, like
Yeah.
straight up to 30 milligrams in the case of Radiant, that we really don't have that need. And again, I'm going to make a parallel with what's happening in the markets. Like you either have the need to titrate on very effective drugs like cenobamates, or you have to control concentrations, or that is multiple times a day. It's complex for those patients. It's life is complex for them to begin with. So that is a huge advantage. But it is not really reliable the first week, right? Like we can have this reduction, but are we repeating again and again? And are we creating a pattern of response? And that's why, at the end of the day, the most reliable way to look into this, one of the reasons why I put the curve on the poster, on the slides, is to understand the process, right? Is the process like reliable week to week? And as you can see here, it is very reliable. It's get deeper. I think what we hear as well, there are several patients in the long-term extension, and we continue to see this response. And thankfully, like many of them are without any seizures right now, and that's what we want to see with this drug, right? It's not only a very rapid response that sustains, but it, just like we were seeing with relutrigine before, and I'm sure we're going to go back to that, is that over time you get amplification of the response and less seizures, and these patients are doing better, and so on. So happy to see that. It's a great translation to Power One, which is one of the posters as well, like we presented. Since, of course, Power One being like coming up later in the year, we wanted to make sure that we had good information to use in Power One, in Power Two, and now, once again, we think we're going to discuss in Power Three. So very happy, but I would say we wouldn't rely on the first week. We had to see really this multi-week response to be comfortable.
Got it. Okay. And that seems to be what's happening over the first 3 weeks.
Absolutely.
Understood.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about the second half of the graph, where it does actually, I mean, it is locally weighted plot smoothing, but it seems to imply a potential further decline, although there is variability around that. I guess what's happening towards the middle and end of this graph, is that a real suggestion of deepening of seizure reduction? And are there any sort of outlier patients that are pulling the graph one way or the other with that sort of increased variability?
Yeah. So as I was mentioning, right, to any given week is probably not the best way to look into this from a reliability standpoint. But when you look across the curve, it is very clear, at least our interpretation, that you see a deepening of response over time, like you see an increase in response. I do expect that to continue even further as we continue to develop the drug. And it's a combination of multiple things, right? So one, I'll say more hypothetical, is this timing between seizures. As you have less seizures, they tend to lead to less seizures as well. And so kind of benefit leads to benefits.
Why is that? Is it just sort of a physiological reset?
Yeah, I think it is moving from the more pathological states to the more physiological states. So as you have more and more like efficacious drugs or treatments or interventions in general, they tend to like space it out. And one of the reasons why you still have such a high unmet need in epilepsy, in focal onset seizures particularly, is when they have a lot of seizures, they end up like, then it leads to more seizures as well. So the inverse is also true. So what we're seeing here is, in a sense, expected. I think the second is, of course, why we get off the gates pretty quickly in terms of the exposure. Like you take a little bit of time, and it's like in the first few days you get to steady state and so on, and then maintaining that, and it was incredibly high compliance in this study. In general, we see these patients doing better. So it's a combination of all things here that we're seeing. And again, happy because Power One is 4 more weeks. So I think it gives us some extra confidence there as well.
I mean, as you bring up power, one of the main topics of discussion around the Radiant data is what would placebo seizure reduction have looked like in this study. So you just toggle over here to the eligibility criteria. What would you have expected that comparative placebo rate to the 56% to have been?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think the best way to look into this, right? You got to look into all the more modern studies in epilepsy, and then ask a number of questions. So the first one is like, how did they behave in similar sites with similar patients and so on. I think you have the very good example from a placebo perspective. We use very, very similar techniques like what Neurocrine did. The drug itself did not work, but nevertheless, I think is actually very good with their NAV 1.6 isoform specific, which was like basically negligible, right, around 0. And all the way to like, because there's always a distribution, all the way to like the mid-teens, like 16, 17, 18, and so on. And then you got to ask the questions like, what makes placebo be amplified versus not? And I think for the most part, what we can find and what's in the literature as well is more incomplete like use of the diaries, incomplete like compliance to the study procedures or unideal than a true placebo effect, right? Like these patients are collecting this data every single day. And that's why, and I'm going to jump ahead on something you're showing there, and it's in the poster as well on the bottom, like of your screen, where one of the key things that one of the questions we have to ask is like there are different types of seizures, right? We tend to talk about like focal seizures, but there are more complex and simpler seizures. I'll not trying to minimize the simpler because they're very problematic to begin with, but there are the like generalization of the seizures or the bilateralization of the seizures versus the like true focal state with that. And we wanted to make sure as well that we're seeing across the board, right? Imagine like if you're a patient, when you talk about placebo effect, I think sometimes we ignore the fact that the patient's just saying, I have the seizure, I have this manifestation, and I'm counting them. But then at the end, that is obviously, in this case, the Epilepsy Study Consortium like classified the seizures for us, and the patient doesn't really know how we sum these seizures up, right? This is always standards, like, so that is a little bit of an exaggeration. I would say that someone would be able to just like even like make it up in terms of placebo. So what is expected, I would say, in a placebo study here, probably would say 10 to 15%. I think that would be quite reasonable to expect in terms of median there. And when you look into that, would be incredibly robust response to begin with.
Got it. Now let's move to some of the new responder analyses that were disclosed. So 22% of patients saw 100% seizure reduction, this top right, in the last 28 days, with 14% being, correct me if I'm wrong, Marcio, 14% being seizure-free over the entire 8-week treatment period of the study, which means 14% of these patients had no seizures in the 2 months after first dose?
In the study, that's correct.
In the study, period. Okay. Did these seizure-free patients, or the 22%, right? Were there any defining characteristics of those patients? Background meds, seizure subtypes, duration of disease, age, anything?
No, not yet. Like, and I would say not yet. Not like we don't have that understanding
Does
yet.
Steve
like
have
if you look into
he's not here to defend himself,
well, he's actually there meeting with physicians like across the street from me. No, I think we debated and we discussed like what can maximize the response for the drug, right? So we know a couple things. For example, we know that like there were more females in this study, right? So like when you look, it looks like there's more females, but just proportionally, there are more females. The duration of the disease, as we call, or in the charts, did not affect. The type of medication background does not seem to affect, which is actually a good thing, right? We don't want to start like pre-selecting patients, I think what we do have maybe more of a hint is if they are treated like I'm going to call properly with background therapy, like it is kind of in the middle of the range for concentration perspective, and you really allow for a physician yesterday said this to me, and I think it's a great way to think about it. It's like you gotta give space for the actual new drug in the case of Madrugine to show what it's capable, right?
Mhm.
And what you're seeing that is like not exaggerated concentrations of all these other drugs or not toxic concentrations of these drugs and really that space. And it is associated, I'm going to say associated with kind of the middle of the range, and the concentrations are higher. So we do see like somewhat of a relationship with PK/PD here
Mhm.
for decision free. And I going to be careful with that because like those numbers are incredibly interesting and very,
Uh-huh.
very exciting, right? But this is a 37 patients, right, that we're talking about in total. So one must be careful on extrapolating it.
So given the curve described before, and then this
Mhm.
difference between the 14 and the 22, what what do you think that the ultimate seizure-free rate, real world seizure-free rate
Yeah.
for vormatrigine could approach? Do you think it's this around this 22 or could it climb even higher?
So I'm gonna jump into the power three
Hmm.
thoughts, right? And I know it's a big jump to jump over power one and power two, but when you think about what the drug could do
Hmm.
eventually, uh, and from the very beginning, right? When you dose this drug and this drug alone, and you allow for that to really have its maximum effect in these patients, we do expect like a very large number of patients to not have seizures. Right? This is a fundamental mechanism. You cannot have a seizure without this mechanism. And in order, like if you modulate it properly, there shouldn't be any. You might remember this. So we used to have actually a very, very similar argument about relutrigine, right? The sister
Yeah.
compound here in GEs, and it was like, all things considered, if we start removing some of the background, and that's why I'm talking about power three,
Hmm.
because you ask real world,
Yeah.
right? Like
Real
what
world.
happens a
Exactly.
few years from now? And I do think that's why there's so much excitement because like right now patients are failing one drug after another, and there is no way to actually get to seizure free in the 25, 30, 40%, whatever that number is going to finally be. But I know it's not going to be a single digit. I know it's not going to
Hmm.
be on the low teens. It's going to be a very high number because that is the progression we see as we keep. So there is both a component of time. So you reduce, and then eventually you don't have any seizures. But there is a component of allowing the drug to work without the confusion that is in the market right now. That is, for
Hmm.
example, levetiracetam is a very ineffective drug, but it's used across the boards. So what happens when we start replacing like LAV, which is like the
Yeah.
SV2As, there by a drug like vermetrogene? That
Hmm.
I think that's the question we need to ask, and
Okay.
it's incredibly exciting to be in this position.
Um, can you talk about how that 22% and the 14% seizure free and 8 week seizure free um, compares to other drug candidates? I know you've got a little comparative poster,
Like
or
charts,
sorry,
yeah,
comparative
yeah,
panel here
yeah, yeah.
on safety. But as we think about efficacy, what is this profile shaping up to be?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's always tricky to do cross trial comparison,
Hmm.
right? But if anything, possibly in epilepsy is a little easier, right? Because we're always looking for the entire distribution and in a sense, the property of those distributions and how the studies are conducted, they're very similar. The patient population is incredibly similar, at least on the last few studies, allow us to infer a little bit better. And I think what we're seeing in the last like cenobamate, well, talk about relevant drugs here, and that's why we put that on the bottom right. I think Xeno has a drug, and and should do pretty well, and cenobamate is a great drug and is doing pretty well on these patients. So we're not talking about drugs that are not efficacious or should not work, right? We're really talking about a comparison with good drugs. And when you look into them kind of across the board, and why we said when we released the data, this best in disease is like, if you look into those response curves, these are really the largest effects ever seen.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we need to continue to see this over time, and power 1, power 2, power 3, and so on, and the real world evidence, as you mentioned. But at this point in time, what we know is that at 8 weeks, those are the best results you can see,
Mm-hmm.
right? We're moving from, comparatively, some of those drugs, or majority of them in the first 8 weeks, are single digits, low single digit zeros across the board.
Yeah.
We're talking about here in the teens. I think that's a huge potential. We're talking about a market with about 3 million patients in the US.
And what about some of the other rates that we see, responder levels that we see
Yeah.
here? We've got different cut points of seizure reduction, 50%, 75%, 90.
Yeah.
We have proportion of patients seeing that 50% meaningful reduction by background ASM mechanism type.
Yeah.
Sort of what does this tell you? Because the background meds look the same. And the response rate is, time dependent.
So
Sorry,
if you think about the response first, right? The top charts there in the middle, like numerically, those are incredible rates. Like we haven't really seen anything like this. The web from the hundreds to the 90, and I think the 90 is quite important because it's like, it kind of anticipates what's happening next, right? If time is important, and we
so
believe
that
time is
90%
important,
essentially is the 22 from the
and it's you start getting a progression, right? You have whatever 10 seizures for 28 days, and you go down to 1. Well, you're not free, but like you're pretty darn close to that, and I think that's the perspective. What might be the most surprising from a prescriber perspective when you talk to physicians is really the effect on top of cenobamate. I think in the last few years, people being like established this drug as a very, very difficult to use but quite efficacious drug. So when we see the proportion that was in the trial, like about 30 or so percent, I think a priori people would say, that is going to be tough to show effects. Because this is if they are on this and there's on cenobamate, they're still having a lot of seizures, they're going to be incredibly difficult to show any response. We were the very first, we still are, the very first trial to actually have any results on cenobamate in the background. Like these other studies we talked about, there was no cenobamate, right? The cenobamate study was only cenobamate, and the Xenon study, there was no cenobamate on it. So the bar was incredibly high, but it's a necessity, right? So this is the markets today, that this drug is part of the armamentarium that physicians have. So the fact that we are actually able to see anything there, let alone the fact that we're seeing phenomenal results, should be very, very exciting. It's like, if you think about like losing weight today is very different than losing weight 10 years ago, right? From a GLP-1, like it's a completely, this to me is the same like way to think about it. It's like now paradigm here is not to do on top of carbamazepine. That is barely used in modern treatments. It's really on this more modern way to treat patients with refractory epilepsy that's the case.
Got it. So we covered a bunch of stuff on efficacy. Oh, we do have a client just has a follow-up to some of the exposure comments that you had earlier, drug exposures. So at the exposure associated with the 45 milligrams, which he pointed out was a Cmax of 472 nanograms per ml, an average plasma level over the dose cycle about 270. What's the modeled probability of seizure free? I'm assuming, well, let's just go with seizure free over the last 4 weeks, which is what I think of as the standard definition. But if you look at that 45 milligram, and you are using 40, I believe, in power 3, right?
That's power 2,
I'm sorry, power 2. what's the seizure-free, the exposure data suggests at Power 2
Yeah,
for the 45?
yeah. So maybe to recap for like the people that there was now the poster is also available, right? That talked about the exposure. That is like the box plots there for the exposure, and what you see basically is linear, somewhat linear, little bits accumulation on the C, or accumulation effect on the Cmax, but not on AUC between like 30 and 45. You can extrapolate to 40 just to level sets everyone. So we're basically talking about 50% more drug on boards. That's another way to think when you go to 40 here or 45. It is, well, as I mentioned before, there's an association between like the higher, the top part of the distribution of concentration and seizure freedom. Now we are moving the entire distribution there, right? So when you increase by 50% or so.
Yeah.
So it is not a linear relationship. It's like quite much larger, the probabilities of having seizure freedom there. In other words, I think when you ask me what's going to happen in the real world, right? The previous question, I'm like, we're talking about a large number. It's always
but if we
tricky
can
to give an
peel off sort of background and just focus here.
When you focus on seizure free, is like the real world, in a sense, for me, is where like a large number of patients do really well with 30. And they don't need anything else, they're seizure free. But then the ones who didn't can go to 40, and that now we're talking about resolving possibly the majority of the patients, right?
Okay.
Of course, to be seen, but we're not expecting small increments. We're expecting like a very large increments if our models are correct, and we believe they are, in terms of the probabilities to become seizure free with 40 milligrams, and why we're excited about Power 2 as well.
Yeah.
Like we get this question from time to time from investors, like, why go to 40 in Power 2? You kind of just got the answer.
Right.
Right? Like we can get a disproportional seizure free. Like right now, this is the best seizure free I study in 8 weeks ever seen. Imagine what else is possible, like with 40. That's kind of the way to think about this.
As we do think about the 40, let's talk about the safety and dropouts. I know when we had the top line data a few weeks ago, a lot of the discussion was around efficacy and how good efficacy was. But I think a lot of investors sort of came into this study assuming vormatrigine was going to like zero out this chart, basically. And it was going to be super safe. There's going to be no dizziness, no somnolence, nothing. And I think people were definitely expecting a lower discontinuation rate per our discussions, although the actual TEAE, the treatment emergent rates are much lower, even if the dropout rates aren't lower. So can you, I guess, talk to us about what drove the dropouts? And do you have specific figures right now for like AE-driven dropouts, just given that TEAE level looks lower than other drugs?
Yeah. So we spent a fair bit of time, as you can imagine, at the time of this preliminary readout and continuously like asking the question in more details, right? Internally and with the sites. And I probably can give you even more confident answer right now, right? So number one, I love how you didn't get lost on the translation here. It is so much lower, the treatment emerging adverse events, that we can't just like brush it off. And I think some people did before, right? You're talking about a significant proportion of patients not having a treatment emerging AE.
Which begs the question, why discontinue if you don't have a treatment emergent AE? Is it efficacy? Could it be? But like the efficacy is good. So
the efficacy is quite phenomenal. So I think it's a number of things. And this is the preliminary conclusion I have. So one of them was really the experience, I would say, of the PIs. And really like with getting this drug,
or with the drug,
right? So and maybe that's a little bit of the tragedy of knowing you are on drug, right? Know your own drug. I think here, like, is a very potent drug. There's an expectation. Even when you consent the patients, they are a little bit more fearful, right? It's like anything that happens in my life is because I'm participating in this clinical study versus it's ironic, right? Because when you have placebo, they're like, I'm not sure I want to be on placebo. But then when you don't have placebo, they get a little bit more on their heads. And we got a little bit this feedback. It was somewhat concentrated in a few sites. One hypothesis we have, and I think we tested now this hypothesis thoughtfully, and it seems to be that really the counseling of the patient makes a huge difference here.
The counseling of the patients around side effects and like what's
around the trial procedures and side effects and really, in a sense, being available for the patients as well. And to the points that, and I mentioned this.
So patient support, essentially.
The patient support from the site personnel. So if this was a widespread in all the sites, I would say this is probably more related to drug. And again, I'm not trying to make up an excuse because it's really not, right?
Well, it's Marcio. I think a lot of the focus is like figuring out what happened here and making sure it doesn't happen in the powers.
Exactly.
So yeah.
Well, and that's what I was going to go. Yeah. That's where I'm going to go. And I know this is not a Reg FT call, but it was another Reg FT call that I mentioned. It's like on power one, it's much, much lower. And of course, it's ongoing and so on. We are not done on those
and the patients that you mentioned that didn't have maybe the best patient support. Are they in the power?
Well, and I would say that's what makes a difference as well, right? I think that's not a complete overlap. There's some overlap, but it's not a complete overlap, and people learn as well.
Okay.
With this, well. And they learn by like willingly or not, right? To improve the overall support, and we're glad to see reflected, right, on Power One, because we really. I agree with what you just said, that it should be much lower in general. And I think that's what you're going to see in the future.
Got it. Okay. When we think about dizziness and somnolence here, can you talk about the grade? Can you talk about potential transients?
Absolutely. The
impact there.
The vast majority of those patients, and we talked about this, right? They are moderate and all transients, right? And that's why I'm saying
transient, like how transient?
A day or two, oftentimes, and sometimes as well. It's just like the time of the day, right? As we know, that is potentially like the Cmax effects with these drugs, like you said. About being clean and it's like zero the chart, I would be very worried if there was no side effects. Very, very worried, right? It's a potent neuroactive drug you expect to see in combination with several other drugs, like 2-3 other anti-seizure medications, all of them with like profiles of side effects. And when you look across the board, right, it is like, remember, 30% or so of the patients were on cenobamates, and you look into the rates in cenobamates, the fact that they're actually lower, it's kind of a little bit of a miracle, right? Because those patients would have something, the big proportion of them. So again, not unhappy with the side effect profile in general, actually. I think the only part we could do better and we're doing better was really on the discontinuation parts.
Got it. Okay. So holistically, Marcio, as we look at this poster, as a commercial guy or former commercial guy, now CEO, obviously.
Once upon a time,
when I first met you, as you look at the commercial, profile, what profile do you see that's emerging that is compellingly differentiated from other options that in the same sort of treatment line for these patients?
So it's funny, right? So if you try to break down and ask, like, what's the minimum profile of this drug does, and what is the maximum or the ideal target profile of this drug does, and you look into the minimum profile, let's assume that this is the minimum, for example. This is And it is already probably dominating the refractory markets, right?
Mhm.
And when you look into that, we're talking about $1.5 billion peak sale, and like massive, um, in a sense. So amazing, right? What can be done. But then what is really exciting, and we're a little anxious actually when we start hearing this, right? That would present this to physicians, particularly, like someone has to prescribe this drug, and so they have to be really convinced and excited about it, and people really are. I think what we heard the most was, wow, I'm finally going to have a way to really replace levetiracetam.
Mhm.
Uh, there has not been a drug in the market or developed that you would move, right? It would start, and that's how it started here. It's incredibly competitive for the refractory markets.
Mhm.
I
Because it's
believe it's
just
going to,
such lev is such a intolerable drug.
well, it is very easy to give. So in a sense, for tolerabilities, but as we know, talk about real like profile of the drug, right? From a side effects profile on the psychiatric sides is very problematic for these
Okay.
patients, and it's not a very effective drug to begin with. So you use as first line because that is kind of, it's relatively easy, and that's what we hear from physicians.
Mhm.
But here you have a drug that is easy and is highly effective.
Yeah.
So that combination of being convenient, I'm going to call, but
Mhm.
highly effective, has not existed in epilepsy treatment. So when you think about, again, real world down the roads, the potential to combine the use across the spectrum of epilepsy, it's even hard to quantify. There has not been a drug that's been there with 3 billion plus. I think that's the number we come up with when we model.
Mhm. Got it. Um, Power One.
Our one.
Let's review quickly. How's
Yeah.
enrollment going? Are we still on track for year end?
Yep.
And, again, based on this data, right? And what you said about the 10 to 15% potential placebo reduction rate. Um, what should investor expectations for seizure reduction be out of Power One?
Yeah. So maybe first on the enrollments, right? We haven't like made any announcement yet. We will soon, but I think we should expect that like things are going really, really well. Uh, but, what we mentioned before, I'm going to say it again, is I think this sets up the stage for what to expect.
Mhm.
So at or better, I think we can confidently say that's kind of
At
what we're
or better.
expecting.
So at or
Yeah.
better than the
It-
56, the
yeah.
22, both?
Than the 56 or
Mhm.
so. And that's the easiest, in a sense, like to benchmark, and might be the most important at this stage of development.
Mhm.
And I say that for a combination of things, right? So one is the time, like we talked about the shape of this curve, like over time, and the fact that when you look into the concentrations that are achieved from a drug concentration in circulation, we're right at the like exposures that give a high effect on our
Yeah.
PKPD modeling. So high level of confidence is always a study, it's
Mhm.
blinded and so on. But I think we should expect very clear effect from a placebo adjusted basis.
Got it. Um, Power Two. What about since you're going up in dose on Power Two, how should people be thinking about that
Yeah.
data relative to Power One and Radiant,
Yeah.
and the timing of that data?
Yeah, so Power 2, so we mentioned about like we're starting right now in the last month of Q3, right? So we're talking about starting like right about now, Power 2. The incredible excitement about participating. I think a lot of the sites like coming to us and saying like we're gonna participate in Power 2 as well, right? And I think we're obviously selecting the sites. This is gonna be a larger study, so we want to make sure people stay
Mhm.
hungry there as well in terms of participation. I think now what we figured out is like that is really a very systematic way to review this patient's profile, to work with the sites, to recruit this consistently patients with epilepsy. So we're fairly comfortable. It's a lot of work. I'm not going to say it's not work, but we're not afraid of recruiting another study or two
Mm-hmm.
studies or whatever it is. So in like about 10 to 12 months, recruitment here is probably what is going to be needed for Power 2. So as you
Mm-hmm.
start right now, we could expect to be finalizing late next year.
Second half of
Oh,
20.
yeah.
Okay.
On the efficacy,
Yeah.
we mentioned this before. Of
Right.
course, if you're going to have higher response,
Right.
you should expect an even better response on the 40 milligrams, should be pretty similar
Mm-hmm.
on the middle dose,
Mm-hmm.
and so on. And that should represent the package, right, between Power 1 and Power 2 that
Mm-hmm.
would allow for a regulatory submission. So that it comes with that impact as well, potentially getting this drug submitted, like let's say in the next 18 months or so to an NDA, which
Mm-hmm.
is really exciting.
How is the Power One enrollment profile looking, patient profile looking versus Radiant?
Yeah, it's from an enrollment perspective, from a recruitment perspective, a lot of the sites actually had like both, as we mentioned before,
Mm-hmm.
and it was actually Power One patients coming to Radiant, and then Radiant done, and then they go into Power
Mm-hmm.
One. The huge advantage of having multiple studies in some of those sites. So I would argue very, very, very similar.
Okay.
The profile
And
of
and
those
that's based on
patients.
what you're seeing, like the patient
Yeah,
flow,
it's
and
based
you're
on what you're
keeping track of
seeing,
it. Okay.
like in terms of like the type, because they're the same patients at the end of the day, right? That are coming here. One of the things we learned, and you might have seen this to take a little detour into the Empower poster, is patients come into the site and they're like, "Oh, I had 3 seizures the last month." And for most studies, like you would be like, "Oh, let's see how you do," and so on, and if you would qualify. But actually, when you start counting, it's significantly more. And I think because no one systematically counts every single day. So what we're trying to do more and more is just say, put them in a diary right away.
Mm-hmm.
And
And
that
these
might
are
have been
electronic diaries now, not paper diaries.
electronic
Yeah. Yeah.
diaries. A lot of the patients historically being on paper diaries, but paper is a little trickier, as you know, in
Yeah.
terms of making sure they be in compliance. We have an electronic system,
Yeah.
and you can see the compliance, which we require to be over 80%, right? 80% of the days with entries, which is basically gold standard for efficacy here, and we see way beyond 80. So that's the good news as well. But as they start counting, you see they're having far more seizures at
Mm-hmm.
baseline, which that might be the simplest thing we've done to ask everyone to bring a diary, and maybe the most effective to actually get recruitments, because then the sites, they're all the same sites for all these studies. They're all the same people, right? Doing these
Mm-hmm.
studies, they're just getting the patients through.
Understood. Um, all right. So I think we've covered vormatrigine. We
I
had,
think so too.
yeah. Oh, we have one last client question about an IV formulation.
Yeah,
What are you
it's
thinking there?
fairly, yeah. So we're asked all the time about this, literally all the time by actually the regulators in Europe, and as part of the PIP, and in the US by physicians all the
Mm-hmm.
time. It's quite insoluble, the molecule. So there are ways. We're working on it. We believe we can solve this problem. It's like we're actively working on an IV formulation. It's not there yet,
I
but
got it.
we believe we have what it takes to get it through.
Got it. All right, let's move to relutrigine now.
Mhm.
How is the EMBOLD study going? And what should we expect to see from that second cohort? Let me switch
Yeah.
over to that poster. Here we go. Yep.
So we talked a little bit about Embold before, right? And
Hmm.
reflect on our guidance. I think what we've been saying is a little unusual, but we said no later than the first half of next year
Hmm.
for the readout, and it's basically on the pace of enrollments. That's what it has to
Hmm.
do. You can imagine when we guided for seizure reduction here, we're talking about 25% as being the actual goal.
Right.
So we're about double of
Yeah.
that. And then when you look into about 1 year after, like 11 months, 1 year, that is 90%. So it was completely like complete disease modifying, right?
Mhm.
Like you should see the communications we get from sites about these families, and like it's just incredible what this drug is doing and how it's changing. So not surprising, there was a lot of interest on enrolling or on participating on this study on the second cohort. So I would say stay tuned, but I couldn't be happier about the pace of
Yeah.
that study. You might have seen we're granted breakthrough designation. I think there are opportunities here with the FDA as well to potentially bring this drug faster to the markets too. So we're exploring all of that. Going to be talking about more about all of that soon. It allows us to open the Emerald study. I know we're talking about them both, but since we don't have like unlimited time, I'm going to try to pack Emerald here as well.
Mhm.
And Emerald is like, we are not adding, for example, new sites or anything like that for Embold, like we just can't, right,
Mhm.
based on where we are. But Emerald is open in the US. It's imminently going to be open in Europe. And it is very, very interesting because I think the message we've been getting to the sites and the message we're from the sites, number one is just how excited they are
Mhm.
about this study. But the second is almost like it is very, very fast what's happening in the US right now with
The
Emerald.
enrollment.
Very fast.
Okay.
It might be the fastest like interest on my study we ever had, or the largest interest on my study we ever had. And it's kind of, so we're trying to pace a little bit all the regions, right, that to get all these patients in. But
And you feel confident in the quality control of the
it's
screening and stuff like that, despite
well,
the fast
it's even
enrollment.
more interesting here too, because we're talking about like centers that have these patients since they were born, basically, right? Or
Okay.
like seeing like this, not naming the centers, but it's all places we know, like that you would bring your kid, and I would bring my kids to when they were kids, to like if we needed like excellent care, like level
Mhm.
4 care in epilepsy. And these patients, I think, differently from the full onset seizures we're talking about, they're all in diaries. They're all like looking to this. There's just nothing that control their seizures. And so it's incredibly exciting. The process itself is very similar in terms of the medical review, education. We do that independently, as you probably know. But you are correct to say we got to ask the question all the time, are those patients appropriate? And so on. It's incredibly stringent, the inclusion exclusion on all these studies, right? And I think these families and the physicians know, and that's why they're excited about
Mhm.
something that can really change. Uh, when you talk about seizure reduction, a lot of people are like, well, it's only seizure reduction, right? And I think it's a little bit idiotic to think that way, right? The key thing here is the seizure.
Mhm.
And when you reduce that by 50, 60, 90% or seizure
Yeah.
free, it's completely life changing for those patients.
Got it. Um, as so we only have about 5 minutes left. I do want to touch on elsunersen, which we haven't
Sure.
discussed in a while, as much recently compared to vormatrigine and certainly relutrigine. But in the posters, you shared a couple of emergency access examples that were quite
Right.
compelling. And so, like, what are you seeing in these children? And you just started the pivotal study. Can you talk about the data flow out of that program?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are two cohorts on the current study, and then I'm going to go
Mhm.
back or share a
Mhm.
little bit an experience with one of the emergency access,
Mhm.
which warms my heart. The study is open right now, the phase 3. We have the second cohort of the previous study that is basically closed.
Yeah.
We're going to release that as soon. We haven't seen the data. I haven't either, because that is randomized, a 1 to 3. But I think in overall, the experience is really fantastic. Like I met
Mhm.
with one of the investigators actually right before this meeting in the Congress, who has a fair bit of these patients on the second cohort, and it was very, very nice to hear all the experience. Now most of these patients transition to the open label, so we can talk
Mhm.
more about benefit and so on. The pace of enrollment is only 40 patients, as you know, on the first cohort.
Yep.
There's a 1 to 2 year old and then a 0 to 1 cohorts as well. And I would say right now there's probably like actually a queue on the sites in Europe and the US and Latin America to enroll in that study. It takes a little longer.
Could you over enroll this study? Would there be a benefit to it, or could you just put people in a
I
expanded
think we're
access?
probably going to put people on an early access type of
Hmm.
mechanism. I think there's a very high interest from the agency as well that we bring this data back. So if you put more patients, it would probably take longer,
Hmm.
and so on. Wouldn't be able to unblind. So we're probably not going to do that. So we're happy with the interest there, with the overall view. You mentioned about some of the emergency access, right? And it's always tricky, right, to approve. Like I think our clinical development folks and safety like review this case before they bring it up to Steve and myself and others in terms of like the final approval. And it is always tricky, right? So these are very fragile kids and a drug that is in the clinic and so on. They can't be eligible to the trial to participate. But when you see things, for example, the latest emergency in the US, which is not completely reflected in the update, so I'm going to just throw it out here there, kids in status like few weeks olds,
Hmm.
and really being able to the FDA phenomenal response, like allowing that to happen and so on. And a few months later, that we are now, and the kids like not only no seizures, but like developmental
Hmm.
milestones being gained, and it is really shows what this drug can do. And you might have seen on Live Like That, as our last minutes, that there was one of the experience on the combination of relutrigine and
Yep.
elsunersen
Yeah.
uh, as well,
What's
and
the
talking.
potential there?
There is only so much on any disease state that one drug can do, right?
Yeah.
For some patients, for those incredibly severe, this patient was having significant seizure activity intrauterus, right? This one patient in Germany. And when
Hmm.
you hear about the not only the seizure improvements, which seems to still incredibly severe, but now the ability for the family to interact with the child's, it is incredible, right? And we could do a lot of the seizure reduction, not being in status, not being readmitted to the hospital with elsunersen. But we really didn't have a lot of the other manifestations that are probably secondary until you added relutrigine on that case.
Hmm.
So we never intended to start to thinking about combination this early in development, but it certainly does show what is possible on these drugs in the future.
Got it. I know we're at time, but I do have a last question about what to
Please.
expect at the end of the year at
Yeah.
in December, probably at epilepsy. Do you guys know what's been accepted at AES
No,
yet? Not yet.
they have not. We
Okay.
have several presentations accepted, but
Mhm.
not the not radiant yet, right?
Okay.
But let's assume it will. I think
Okay.
we can assume it
Hmm.
will as late breaking presentation. What we would be seeing there is like the full cohorts for like over 60 patients with focal and the
And
cohort of
generalized as well. Yeah.
and generalized.
Got it.
And I think everyone's going to be like quite excited about
And
seeing
a
that
year
and
from
the
now at
potential of the drug.
IEC.
A year from now, then well, then we'll have long-term data, and
Hmm.
on the European Congress, right? So there's an
Hmm.
alternated international European Congress. We'll have Power One and the long term for that, and for AES as well. We've been getting, and you saw based on the client's questions, you got a lot of questions about the modeling as well, right? For Power Two, I think people are going to be
Hmm.
starting asking questions about Power Two about
Yeah.
this time next year. So we intend to put a lot more of the modeling data out as
Got it.
well, like around AES and AEN and so on.
Understood. Great. With that, we are over time. Marcia has been very helpful. Thank you for all your patience in
Likewise.
dealing with me on the Radiant poster and the
It's all
client
good.
questions coming in. If anybody has any other outstanding questions that you guys didn't email me, please feel free. I will follow up with Marcio and Tim, Athena and I, and we will get you those answers. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning.
Thank you so much, Rita. Thank you, everyone.